Hi everybody, my name is Larsen. The most important part of sounding like jazz is probably to have some of the bebop language or bebop phrasing in your playing. In this video I'm going to take a C7 in a fairly common position, so here on the neck, and then I'm going to go over some examples of how you can add some bebop phrasing or some chromatic phrases into your playing in this position. Finding practical solutions and making sure that whenever you're trying to learn something new, you're connecting it with something that you already have in your playing. So I would expect you would have this position for a C7 in your system. It's going to make it a lot easier for you to learn something and add it to your playing. And this is also pretty much how I work. I take new things and try to attach them to the things that I already know. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, improve the way that you solo, or check out some new arpeggios or chord voicings, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. The examples that I'm going to cover in this video are all found around this chord, and you can probably easily connect this to this arpeggio. And of course around here you will also have a scale, and whether you want to call that a C7 scale or an F major scale, it would be this scale. In this first example, I'm adding a chromatic note in between the D, so the ninth here D, and the root C. So I'm adding a D flat, and the way I'm playing it is that I'm actually playing the D and then the D flat, picking both notes, and then pulling off down to the C. Then I'm just continuing down the scale, again with a pull off, and then ending the phrase with a C major triad. So it's still really connected to the chord, which is of course also important for bebop, that we're really working with lines that are coming out of the chords that we're playing on. And then we have sort of the chromatical flavor added in the beginning of the line. You also want to notice that the way I'm ending the line is on the one and. So that's also very typical, and actually that's how the genre was named, because it's called bebop. In this example, I'm using a longer chromatic phrase on the B string. So the first part of it is really just sort of a major pentatonic or a blues phrase. And then on the B string, in this position, we actually have three really strong notes for C7, because we have the 5th, the 13, and the flat 7. So I'm using that, and I'm playing a descending line, adding the flat 13 in here. So we have this phrase, so, and then again ending with the C major triad. This phrase is using two really strong bebop ideas. The first one is pivoting arpeggios, and that's the first thing that happens in the phrase. So the line is kind of coming out of an E half diminished arpeggio, so the notes that we have are E, G, B flat and D, but I'm pivoting that arpeggio, so I'm playing the E an octave higher, and then skipping down to the third, the G, and then playing this, which is basically a G minor triad, ascending. So, and this is a very common phrase to use with different kinds of arpeggios. If you play it in major, it's sometimes referred to as the honeysuckle rose phrase. I have another video where I'm analyzing part of a George Benson solo where he's soloing on All Things You Are, and he uses this quite a lot. So it's also worth checking that out. I'll link to that in a card in this video, and of course also in the description. The other thing that I'm doing is that I'm adding a chromatic passing note between the root and the 7th. So we get this phrase. And this is something that is really common for a lot of different bebop pieces, bebop phrases. And you want to check that out and have that in your playing for sure. So what I'm doing here is I'm just playing that line, descending from C, skipping down to the G, up to the A, and then just continuing up the scale. In this phrase, I'm adding a chromatic approach that's 2 notes long. So of course I start on the 5th of the chord, so the G, going down to the F, and I'm skipping down to the D, and I really want to go to the E, but I'm skipping down to the D, and then just moving up to the E chromatically. So from here I just start a small run that's really just in an E half diminished arpeggio. And the reason why I'm using the E half diminished arpeggio is that that's the arpeggio that's found on the 3rd of the chord. And it's very often quite useful to use the arpeggio that's found on the 3rd, so the diatonic arpeggio from the 3rd of the chord. That's what I'm doing here. So, and it's not just playing straight up and down the arpeggio, I'm also making a short melody with it. So skipping up to the 7 here, and then ending the line on the root. Encircling a chord tone with two notes where one is diatonic and the other one is chromatic is also a thing that's done very often in bebop. And that's also what I'm doing here. I'm aiming for the fifth, the G, but I'm starting with first the diatonic note above, so A, and then going down to the F sharp, which is chromatic and just below, and then resolving that to the G. Now from the G, I'm moving up the G minor 7, so the diatonic arpeggio from the fifth of the chord, which is then a G minor 7 arpeggio. And from here it moves into a pattern in C7, so first the third, down to the root, up to the fifth, and then down to the third again, and then via the 13 up to the flat 7. So you want to notice here also that most of the lines that I'm playing here are really just starting with chord tones and really following the chords and using structures that are closely related to the chord, which means the C7 itself, or arpeggios like the one from the third, which is E half diminished, or the one from the fifth, that's the G minor 7. And this way of really connecting to the chords is also an important part of playing jazz, besides all the chromatic and rhythmical things that are happening. If you want to check out some more great bebop ideas or licks, then check out this video on George Benson, where I analyze a phrase from his solo on All the Things You Are and talk about how he makes that phrase and what it's constructed of. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, then subscribe to my channel. These are the kind of videos that I publish every week, and of course if you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next week.